The night she spoke, my empire didn't fall, my ego did. I used to think my life was proof that the world made sense. I was Dominic Ashford, a New York real estate billionaire who built towers where other men saw empty blocks and turned quiet neighborhoods into headlines. I came up through scholarships, ruthless internships, and an Ivy League education that taught me to speak like certainty itself. I loved the sound of my own clarity, the way rooms leaned toward me when I talked. I treated articulation like authority and authority like oxygen. In my mind, intelligence wasn't something you carried quietly. It announced itself, demanded space, and left witnesses behind. I built my identity around being the sharpest mind at every table. At conferences, I talked about vision and discipline, with the same calm I use when approving demolitions. At charity galas, I spoke about education as if I personally invented opportunity. People clapped because I sounded believable. I surrounded myself with lawyers who quoted case studies, analysts who spoke in numbers, and friends who wore learning like jewelry. I didn't just want success. I wanted to look like the kind of man who deserved it. In that world, silence rarely meant depth. Silence meant you didn't have the tools to compete. Marian Ellis had been in my penthouse for 12 years, and for most of that time I barely registered her as anything beyond reliability. She moved like a shadow trained to respect boundaries, quiet footsteps, careful hands, eyes lowered at the right moments. She never interrupted. She never volunteered opinions. She didn't laugh at my jokes the way other people did to earn favor. She simply did her work with a calm that felt almost old-fashioned. To me, she became part of the background, the same way the city becomes background when you're high enough above it. I told myself I was respectful. I told myself I treated her well. But beneath that was an assumption I never admitted out loud: she was uneducated. It wasn't one moment that convinced me. It was my own pattern of thinking, reinforced by how everyone else behaved. Guests didn't greet her, even when she stood 3 feet away. A visiting executive once handed her an empty glass without looking at her face, like she was furniture with hands. I noticed it and did nothing. My silence became permission. Sometimes I'd hear her answer a simple question with a quiet, "Yes, sir," and I'd take that as confirmation that she didn't have much more to offer. I called it realism. If I'll be honest, it was comfort in hierarchy. The strange part was that Marian handled things that required more than routine. Confidential documents landed on my kitchen island, and somehow they always ended up where they needed to be. Calendar conflicts disappeared before I ever confronted them. Packages that could have exposed sensitive business details arrived and vanished into secure storage without my assistant getting involved. One afternoon, I caught my assistant Martha scanning a folder Marian had organized. Martha blinked twice and muttered, "She's thorough." I smirked and said, "Thorough doesn't mean educated." Martha didn't respond, but the silence she gave me felt different from Marian's. It felt like restraint. My son Ethan noticed more than he spoke. He was 16, tall, observant, and painfully unimpressed by the performance adults called success. He watched the way people treated each other the way I watched market trends. One night, after a dinner where my investors argued about intellectual capital over imported wine, Ethan followed me into my office and asked, "Why don't you ever ask Marian anything?" I glanced up from my laptop and said, "Because that's not her job." He didn't flinch. "What if that's just what you decided?" he said. I laughed like he'd made a naive point, and I answered with the confidence I used to end negotiations. People are what they show you. Still, I never once asked Marian about her background. Not even casually. I never wondered what books she read, what her childhood looked like, what she believed in when no one was watching. I assumed her life started the day she stepped into my home and ended the day she left it. That's how privilege works when it's quiet. It edits other people into supporting characters without asking permission. I told myself my world ran on competence, yet I never considered that competence could hide intelligence, or that silence could be strategy rather than limitation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I enjoyed the order her quietness provided. My penthouse was full of voices competing for attention. Marian never competed. She offered no challenge, no complexity, no mirror held up to my blind spots. Her presence kept the machine running while I remained a headline. Control disguised itself as confidence, and I wore it effortlessly. I didn't know I was building an illusion. I thought I was simply living in the truth I earned. Then came the investor dinner that would expose more than my missing paperwork. The table was filled with people who could make or break my next deal, and everything had been staged perfectly until a critical financial projection report vanished minutes before I needed it. My throat tightened as I flipped through folders, the conversation around me turning sharper. I felt eyes shift, impatience rising, and without thinking I turned toward the only person I expected to be invisible. Marian. I said, sharper than I intended, "Where is it?" And she looked at me with a calm that didn't match the panic in the room, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. I expected her to apologize. Instead, she observed. The room had been designed for dominance. Floor to ceiling glass framed Manhattan like a trophy, and the skyline shimmered beneath us as if it belonged to the men seated at my table. 8 investors. 1 acquisition. A deal that would expand my real estate portfolio into a territory my competitors had been circling for years. Crystal glasses caught the light. The air smelled faintly of oak and expensive cologne. Everything was aligned. Until it wasn't. When I reached for the updated projection report, the one outlining revised profit margins, it wasn't in the folder where I had left it. My fingers flipped through the pages again, slower this time, as if precision could will it into existence. It wasn't there. The conversation softened around me, but I could feel the shift. Investors notice hesitation the way predators notice weakness. One of them, Richard Halbrook, tilted his head slightly. "Is everything all right, Dominic?" His voice was polite. His eyes were not. "It's fine," I said smoothly, though my pulse had tightened. "Just a minor misplacement." But it wasn't minor. The revised numbers addressed a risk they had already questioned. Without them, I looked unprepared. Sloppy, and that was when I turned toward Marian. She stood near the far wall, hands folded lightly in front of her, posture steady as always. I felt irritation rise before I filtered it. "Marian," I said, sharper than I intended, "the updated projection file. It was on the island this afternoon." Every pair of eyes in the room followed mine to her. For a second, a brief, telling second, I expected her to lower her gaze and apologize. That was the rhythm we all understood. Staff corrected mistakes. Executives controlled outcomes. Instead, she simply nodded once, not submissive, not defensive, just certain. "It was relocated for security purposes, sir," she said evenly. "The updated file is in the secondary archive drawer in your study. The blue tab, the blue tab." I blinked, irritation colliding with surprise. I hadn't mentioned color coding. I hadn't even remembered implementing one. I excused myself with controlled calm and walked briskly to the study. My mind ran ahead of me. Secondary archive, blue tab. When had that system been created? The drawer slid open smoothly. There it was. The updated report, neatly aligned, color, coded exactly as she described. For a moment, I just stared at it. Back in the dining room, I resumed the presentation as if nothing had happened. The numbers landed cleanly. Questions were answered. Doubt softened. Control restored. Afterward, Richard chuckled lightly. "You run a tight ship, Dominic. Even your staff handles sensitive material like analysts," another investor added, half smiling. "Hard to find help like that these days. She must follow instructions well." I felt the comment hover in the air, harmless on the surface, edged underneath. I laughed it off. "She's efficient," I said. "Knows her place." The phrase came out casually, too casually. Ethan was seated near the end of the table. He wasn't part of the negotiation, but I liked him observing power in motion. When I said those words, his eyes lifted slowly from his plate to mine. There was no anger in his expression, just recognition. Marian continued serving without interruption, but I noticed something different in her posture, not smaller, not diminished. If anything, steadier. as though she had seen this dynamic before and already decided it didn't define her. The deal closed that evening. Handshakes sealed it. Numbers confirmed it. The investors left impressed, and I stood at the window once more, the city glowing beneath me like validation. Later, as the staff cleared the table, I stepped into the hallway and found Marion organizing a stack of files. "You moved the report without informing me," I said, my tone measured. "You mentioned earlier that unauthorized guests would be passing through, sir." She replied calmly. "I assumed confidentiality was priority." Assumed. Her choice of word lingered. I nodded once. "Next time notify me." "Of course." No apology, no fluster. Just compliance delivered without weakness. That should have unsettled me more than it did. Instead, I returned to my office convinced I was still the most educated person under my roof. Whatever systems she'd implemented, they were procedural, not intellectual. Organized hands did not equal analytical mind. That was how I framed it. Ego has a way of smoothing over disruption. Near midnight, I walked through the quiet kitchen to pour myself a drink. The penthouse had settled into silence. The deal was secure, my authority intact. The moment at dinner already shrinking into memory. That was when I saw Ethan kneeling beside Marion's cleaning cart. He wasn't supposed to be there. He looked up at me slowly, holding something in his hands, something worn, leather-bound, and clearly not part of any cleaning supply. "Dade," he said quietly, his voice lacking accusation but heavy with something else. "You need to see this." I frowned slightly. "See what?" He stepped closer and handed me the notebook. And the first page I opened didn't contain reminders or grocery lists. It contained market analysis more detailed than what my junior analysts prepared. My breath slowed. Because what I was reading wasn't efficiency. It was expertise. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to fracture the certainty I had carried for decades. The cleaning cart held something I never expected, proof that I had been blind. I stood in my kitchen past midnight. The skyline dimmed behind me, that holding a worn leather notebook that clearly did not belong among disinfectants and folded rags. Ethan watched me without speaking. There was something steady in his expression, something that felt less like accusation and more like inevitability. "Where did you get this?" I asked quietly. "It fell out when she moved the cart," he replied. "I don't think she knows I have it." That unsettled me more than if she had handed it to him directly. I opened the notebook again, slower this time. The handwriting was precise, structured, disciplined. No rushed scribbles. No scattered thoughts. The first few pages outlined macroeconomic theory with citations from academic journals I recognized immediately. Not simplified explanations. Not summaries copied from headlines. This was layered analysis, annotated arguments, counterpoints, data correlations. I flipped further. Charts sketched by hand. Comparative housing market trends. Risk exposure breakdowns. Even speculative notes on urban redevelopment zones, some of which overlapped with my own acquisition strategies. My throat tightened slightly. I turned to a page dated 8 months earlier. It contained a forecast predicting a supply chain disruption that would temporarily depress construction costs before rebounding sharply. I remembered that shift. I had capitalized on it aggressively. She had anticipated it, weeks before it became visible in public data. "That doesn't mean anything," I muttered under my breath. Ethan heard me anyway. "It means she knew." I shot him a look. Knowing trends isn't the same as understanding execution. But even as I said it, I recognized the weakness in my defense. I flipped again. Another dated entry. A breakdown of municipal bond instability connected to infrastructure, overspending in 2 districts I had been monitoring. She had circled one district and written, "High risk exposure disguised as opportunity." I had invested in that exact district and nearly lost 7 figures before adjusting course. The dates were clear. Her prediction preceded my correction. My disbelief didn't explode. It expanded quietly, pressing against the walls of my certainty. I closed the notebook halfway and leaned against the counter. For years, I had measured intelligence by degrees, networks, articulation. I had believed education lived in framed certificates and alumni associations. I remembered the day I graduated from Columbia, my parents in the crowd, my name echoing across the auditorium. I had built my empire partly on that pedigree. I wore it like armor. And here I was, standing barefoot in my own kitchen, realizing the woman I had categorized as uneducated possessed a sharper macroeconomic awareness than half the analysts on my payroll. "How long has she been writing this?" I asked. Though Ethan couldn't possibly know, long enough, he said softly. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I watched Marion differently. Not obviously. I'm too controlled for that. But there was a new awareness behind my gaze. She moved through the kitchen the same way she always had, efficient, composed, self-contained. If she noticed the subtle shift in my attention, she didn't show it. I found myself studying her hands as she arranged breakfast plates. Steady hands. Deliberate movements. I tried to imagine those same hands drafting economic projections late at night. The image didn't align with the hierarchy I had built in my mind. My ego resisted adjusting. It whispered explanations that preserved my structure. Maybe she copied the notes. Maybe she attended a few community classes. Maybe she had someone advising her. I searched for reasons that would allow me to remain superior. But the evidence was undeniable. The language was academic, the analysis original, the thinking independent. There was something else in the notebook that unsettled me even more. On one page, beneath a detailed housing trend forecast, she had written a single sentence. Silence allows observation. Observation allows advantage. I stared at that line longer than I wanted to admit. Had she been observing me? Not maliciously, not strategically, but intelligently. For 12 years, I had spoken freely in rooms where she stood present but invisible. I had debated projections aloud. I had criticized competitors openly. I had revealed patterns and concerns within earshot of someone I believed couldn't interpret them. And she had been listening. The thought didn't make me angry. It made me uneasy. Later that afternoon, I retreated to my study to finalize notes for the upcoming Education Foundation Gala. I was scheduled to deliver a keynote speech on meritocracy, on how opportunity rewards those who pursue knowledge relentlessly. The irony began forming slowly, like a bruise under the skin. I adjusted my tie in the mirror and rehearsed a line about how education separates aspiration from achievement. The words sounded polished, convincing, but they echoed differently now. If education truly separated aspiration from achievement, then what did that make Marion? A failure, or someone denied recognition? I tried to shake the thought. My world depended on structure, on knowing who fit where, on believing the ladder I climbed was visible to everyone. And yet, somewhere between the cleaning cart and the leather notebook, that ladder no longer looked as solid. As evening approached and the gala car arrived downstairs, I slipped the notebook into my briefcase. I told myself I would return it discreetly later. I told myself this discovery didn't change anything. But deep down, I knew it changed everything. Because in a few hours, I would stand on stage preaching opportunity and intellectual discipline. And I had no idea that the most educated person in the room might not be me. I built my name on opportunity, but I never realized who I was overlooking. The gala ballroom shimmered with calculated elegance. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors, and banners bearing the foundation's crest hung behind the stage like declarations of virtue. The room was filled with donors, trustees, policy advocates, and executives who believed education was the purificancy of progress. I moved through them with ease, shaking hands, accepting praise, inhabiting the version of myself that thrived under admiration. The leather notebook sat inside my briefcase in the coach room. I told myself it was temporary, irrelevant, a curiosity. When my name was announced, applause filled the room before I even reached the podium. I adjusted the microphone, glanced at the teleprompter, and felt the familiar rush of control settle over me. Public speaking had always been my territory. Words bent easily when I shaped them. I stand here tonight as proof. I began, my voice steady and measured, that access to education transforms ambition into achievement. Heads nodded. Pens moved across programs. Cameras captured every angle. I spoke about literacy rates, about upward mobility, about the discipline required to rise above circumstance. I described my scholarship years, my late nights studying financial models, my belief that meritocracy rewards those who pursue knowledge relentlessly. I emphasized hard work, focus, personal responsibility. Success, I said confidently, belongs to those who earn it. The applause that followed felt solid, reassuring. As I scanned the room during the applause, my eyes drifted toward the back near the service corridor. Marion stood there among catering staff, posture composed, expression unreadable. She had insisted on accompanying the event team from my household due to logistical coordination. I hadn't objected. Now, seeing her there while I delivered a speech on earned success unsettled something I didn't want to name. The Q&A session began smoothly. Donors asked predictable questions about grant allocation and mentorship initiatives. I responded with precision, citing statistics and strategic goals. Then an older donor, Margaret Llewellyn, leaned toward her microphone. "Mr. Ashford," she said thoughtfully, how do we ensure we're not overlooking talent in communities where potential exists but visibility doesn't? Sometimes brilliance isn't packaged in confidence." The question lingered longer than the others. I answered carefully. Our responsibility is to create platforms where merit can surface. Opportunity reveals capability. Ethan, seated near the front as part of a youth leadership program, shifted in his chair. I noticed but continued. Margaret wasn't finished. "And what about individuals already within our proximity? Staff members, employees, people we interact with daily but may underestimate." A subtle ripple passed through the room. Before I could redirect, Ethan stood. My stomach tightened. He didn't speak loudly, but the microphone caught his voice clearly. "I've seen analytical insights in unexpected places," he said. "Sometimes the most informed perspectives aren't the loudest." A few guests glanced around curiously. Margaret smiled. "Would you care to elaborate?" Ethan hesitated only briefly. "For example, Marion." The name landed like glass against marble. Several heads turned toward the back of the room. I felt heat rise behind my collar, though my expression remained composed. I gave a soft chuckle, attempting to diffuse the shift. "Marion is incredibly organized," I said lightly. "But I doubt she'd want to debate economic reform tonight." A few polite laughs surfaced, thin and uncertain. The air changed. It was subtle but undeniable. The room no longer felt aligned behind me. It felt observant. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Why not let her decide? Before I could respond, one of the foundation coordinators, perhaps sensing an unexpected opportunity for inclusivity, motioned toward the back. "If Marion is willing, we'd love to hear her perspective on education access." My pulse quickened. This wasn't in the program. This wasn't controlled. Marion remained still for a moment. The spotlight did not yet reach her, but attention did. I caught her eye briefly across the room. There was no panic in her expression, no resentment, only calm awareness. I leaned toward the microphone. "There's no pressure," I added quickly, my tone framed as gracious but edged with caution. "Not everyone is comfortable speaking publicly." The implication was clear. The coordinator extended a handheld microphone toward her. I expected her to decline. That would restore order. That would protect the hierarchy. The room grew quiet enough to hear fabric shift and glasses set down gently on tables. Marion stepped forward, not hurried, not hesitant. She accepted the microphone, and when she finally began to speak, the room went completely silent. When she spoke, I realized intelligence does not need permission. Marion did not clear her throat nervously or glance at me for approval. She held the microphone with steady hands and began in a voice that carried neither hesitation nor defiance, only clarity. "Access to education," she said evenly, "is not the same as access to recognition." The sentence landed softly but decisively. She continued, articulating economic disparities with the kind of structured logic I recognized immediately from academic conferences. She referenced labor market elasticity, generational wealth gaps, and the measurable impact of informal caregiving responsibilities on long-term career trajectories. She spoke without notes, that without searching for vocabulary, the ballroom had been prepared for applause, not recalibration. I earned a master's degree in economics 12 years ago, she added calmly. My thesis focused on urban housing inequity and capital flow distortions in marginalized communities. A ripple passed through the room. Not loud, not chaotic, just stunned. I felt something inside me tilt. She explained that shortly after completing her degree, her mother fell ill. Medical bills mounted. Academic prospects dissolved under financial strain. Stability became priority over prestige. She took domestic work not because she lacked options, but because she needed immediate income with flexibility. Dignity does not disappear when titles do, she said. Invisible labor is still labor. Unacknowledged intelligence is still intelligence. No bitterness colored her tone. That was what unsettled me most. She wasn't accusing. She was informing. She spoke about systemic barriers that push capable individuals into survival roles. About how society often equates silence with incapacity. About how proximity to power does not guarantee participation in it. And every word felt like it had been quietly accumulating for years. I stood on that stage beside her, suddenly aware of how small my earlier laughter had sounded. The audience wasn't looking at me anymore. They were studying her. Margaret Llewellyn leaned forward in her seat, visibly moved. A trustee from a prominent university whispered something to his colleague. Phones lifted, Descons attendees began recording. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt dismantled. There is a difference. Humiliation is loud. It demands reaction. What I felt was quieter, a structural crack forming inside a belief system I had never questioned. When Marian finished, the applause was not immediate. It built slowly, as if the room needed a moment to process what had just shifted. Then it rose, steady and undeniable. I clapped too. I had to. After the formal session ended, clusters of donors approached her. Not politely, intentionally. They asked about her research, about her thesis, about her perspective on housing reform. I watched as she engaged with them effortlessly, citing data, responding to complex questions without flinching. Richard Halbrook, the same investor who complimented her efficiency at my dinner table, now nodded at her insights with professional respect. I felt the irony burn quietly beneath my collar. Ethan approached her first. I saw the admiration in his face, unfiltered and unapologetic. He wasn't surprised. He looked affirmed. As I stood there, conversations buzzing around us, fragments of memory began replaying in my mind. The times I had dismissed her silence. The times I had said, she knows her place. The way I had laughed lightly when her name was mentioned in an intellectual context. She had never corrected me. Not once. Not when investors made condescending remarks. Not when I implied complexity was beyond her interest. Not even when my son challenged me. She hadn't needed to. That realization struck harder than her credentials. The unexpected twist came as I checked my phone minutes later. Notifications flooded the screen. Clips of her speech were already circulating. A foundation staff member had live-streamed the event. Comments poured in praising her clarity, her composure, her lived experience. Some praised me for highlighting hidden talent. The praise felt undeserved. Others questioned how someone with her background had remained in domestic work for so long. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Control had shifted in a way I couldn't immediately measure. On the drive home, Marian sat in the back seat beside the event coordinator, composed as ever. I sat in the front, staring at the city lights passing by the window. No one spoke. The silence felt different now. When we arrived at the penthouse, she stepped out first, thanking the coordinator for the opportunity. Her tone carried professionalism, not triumph. Inside, the marble floors reflected the overhead lights the same way they always had. Nothing about the physical space had changed. But I had. I walked into my office and closed the door behind me. The leather notebook sat inside my briefcase, heavy now than it had felt before. For years, I believed I was the most educated person under my roof. Tonight proved otherwise. And as the city hummed beyond the glass, I understood that the real confrontation was not happening online, not in boardrooms, not in headlines. It was happening inside me, My power always depended on being the smartest in the room, until I wasn't. I closed my office door and replayed the video of Marion's speech on my phone for the third time that night. The footage was steady, professionally framed despite being captured on a donor's device. Her voice carried the same calm precision it had in the ballroom. No tremor. No apology. Just command of subject and self. I watched the audience's faces more than I watched her. I saw the moment they leaned forward. The moment they recalculated. The moment respect shifted direction. Then I watched myself, standing beside her, posture rigid, expression composed, but hollowed out. A man accustomed to applause suddenly unsure of where to place his hands. I muted the video and leaned back in my chair. The skyline outside my office window looked unchanged, but the silence inside the room felt different, heavier, less obedient. I began dissecting my own thoughts the way I would analyze a flawed investment. Where had the assumption started? At what point had I decided that silence equaled ignorance? The answer was uncomfortable because it was layered. It wasn't just about Marion. It was about how I was trained to see the world. Intelligence in my world had a uniform, confident speech, elite institutions, visible ambition. Anything quieter felt secondary. I had never consciously told myself that a black woman working in my home could not hold a master's degree. But I had never imagined that she did. That was the bias. Subtle, unquestioned, efficient. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Ethan stepped inside without waiting for permission, something he rarely did. "You watched it again, didn't you?" he asked. "Yes." He studied me for a moment before speaking again. "You always say the market punishes blind spots." I didn't respond. "This wasn't the market," he continued quietly. "It was you." The simplicity of his statement stripped away any defensive language I might have used. "I never said she wasn't intelligent," I said carefully. "You never had to," he replied. The words lingered long after he left the room. My phone buzzed repeatedly on the desk. Messages from business partners, investors. A few congratulated me for spotlighting hidden brilliance. Others asked directly whether Marion would be consulting on housing strategy moving forward. One message from Richard Halbrook read, "Impressive mind. Didn't know you had that kind of analytical support in-house." Support, as if she had always been part of my intellectual machinery, waiting for acknowledgement. An hour later, my board chair called. "We've reviewed the clip," he said. "There's opportunity here." Offering her an advisory position could reflect progressive leadership. Progressive leadership. The suggestion felt less like praise and more like displacement. If Marion stepped into an advisory role, she wouldn't just be staff. She would be voice, influence, presence in rooms I had carefully curated. I realized then that my discomfort wasn't about public embarrassment. It was about hierarchy destabilizing. For years, I had unconsciously benefited from her silence. My comments, my assumptions, my condescension, none of it had been challenged. She had protected my dignity by absorbing it quietly. That realization cut deeper than any external criticism. If she had chosen to expose me earlier, at a dinner, in front of investors, she could have. She had the intellect, the language, the evidence. She didn't. Not because she couldn't, because she didn't need to. That distinction unraveled something inside me. I stood from my desk and walked into the darkened kitchen. The marble island gleamed under soft lighting, pristine and indifferent. I imagined all the conversations that had happened here, strategy sessions, critiques of competitors, jokes about elite circles. She had heard them all, and she had chosen restraint. Privilege isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the comfort of assuming you're the most informed person in the room without having to prove it. I had built an empire on strategic foresight, yet I had been strategically blind in my own home. The thought exhausted me. Near midnight, I finally returned to my office and opened the leather notebook again. The line I had noticed earlier stared back at me. Silence allows observation. Observation allows advantage. She had never been invisible. I had simply refused to see her. The next morning, sunlight cut sharply across my desk as I arrived downstairs earlier than usual. The house felt different, or maybe I did. Martha approached me hesitantly. Mr. Ashford, Marian asked me to give this to you. She handed me a sealed envelope. My chest tightened before I even opened it. The letter was brief, professional, composed. She had submitted her resignation. The moment I understood her value was the moment I risked losing her. The resignation letter felt heavier than any contract I had ever signed. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't dramatic, it was composed, professional, and final. 2 weeks' notice. Gratitude for the opportunity. A brief acknowledgement of recent developments. Recent developments. I found her in the kitchen later that morning, sunlight stretching across the marble counters. She was organizing a shipment log, posture steady, movements unchanged. If the weight of last night's shift rested on her shoulders, she carried it effortlessly. Marian, I said, my voice lower than usual. We need to talk. She looked up, not startled, not defensive. Of course. There was no tension in her tone. That unsettled me more than anger would have. I gestured toward my office, but she remained where she was. We can speak here, she said gently. The control dynamic shifted in that small refusal. Not confrontational, just balanced. I received your letter, I began. For once, I didn't know how to frame the conversation strategically. No prepared language. No negotiation leverage. You don't have to leave. She studied me for a long moment. I do, she replied calmly. Remaining in a place where my worth was misjudged requires constant negotiation of dignity. The sentence wasn't sharp, it was factual. I misjudged you. I admitted, the words scraping against my pride as they surfaced. I assumed. I dismissed. And I was wrong. There it was, stripped of polish. She nodded slightly, not in victory, but acknowledgement. Assumptions are not unusual, she said. They are structural. Structural. The word for intended disrespect, I said, aware of how insufficient that sounded. Intent and impact are not the same, she replied evenly. Silence protected stability. It did not mean agreement. That realization hit deeper than any public exposure. For 12 years, she had protected the smooth functioning of my household and my ego by choosing not to confront me. Not because she lacked the capacity, because she understood the consequences. I should have asked, I said quietly. About your background, about your education, about you. Yes, she answered simply. The absence of resentment in her voice made my failure feel larger. As if the universe wanted to underline the moment, my phone vibrated repeatedly on the counter between us. I glanced down. 3 missed calls. 2 emails. All referencing her. One message read, would Ms. Ellis consider consulting independently? Her housing analysis was exceptional. They were reaching out to her. Not through me. To her. I felt the last thread of superiority loosen. I don't want you to leave, I said again, but this time it wasn't about convenience. It was about correction. Not as staff. She waited. I want to offer you a partnership, I continued. An advisory role within my firm. Direct access. Equal platform. It wasn't charity. It wasn't damage control. It was the only structure that made sense now. She didn't respond immediately. She turned slightly, resting her hand against the counter as if measuring the space between who I had been and who I was attempting to become. I do not need rescue, she said softly, nor do I require elevation to validate my education. I know, I replied quickly. This isn't elevation. It's acknowledgement. The air between us felt charged, but not hostile. It felt honest. Ethan appeared in the doorway, hesitating before stepping fully into the kitchen. He looked at Marian with open admiration. You don't owe anyone comfort, he said gently. But you changed something. She smiled faintly at him, the first visible crack in her composure. I never intended to change anyone, she said. I only intended to speak. Her humility magnified mine. I exhaled slowly. I built my worldview on merit, I said. But I only recognized merit when it looked like me, sounded like me, carried the same credentials visibly. She didn't interrupt. I allowed bias to sit quietly in my decisions, I continued. Not loud racism. Not explicit dismissal. But something more insidious. I saw you through a narrow lens because it was comfortable. The admission felt surgical. Silence followed, not avoidance, but evaluation. Finally, she spoke. I will consider staying, she said carefully. but not as an employee whose intelligence is discovered accidentally. My chest tightened slightly. What does that mean? It means, she replied, her gaze steady, the power dynamic must change permanently, publicly, structurally, not privately corrected and quietly forgotten. The words hung between us like a contract not yet signed. I had spent my entire career protecting hierarchy. Now I was being asked to dismantle it. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether I had the courage to follow through. Some lessons cost more than tuition. They cost pride. Marian did not answer me that morning. She told me she would consider my proposal and left the gym with the same calm she had always carried. For the first time in years, I felt uncertain inside my own home. 2 days later, she requested a meeting, not in my office, but in the conference room at my firm. That detail alone shifted everything. When she entered the room, she did not walk in as staff. She carried a slim portfolio and placed it on the table between us. Her posture was steady, her expression composed but resolved. "I will accept a consulting position," she said, her voice level, independent, contract-based, no employment hierarchy, direct access to strategy discussions. My analysis will not be filtered. There were no demands in her tone, only standards. I nodded. "You'll have full autonomy and transparency," she added. "I will not operate invisibly." The phrase struck something deep. For 12 years, invisibility had been imposed on her without protest. Now she was refusing it without anger. The contract we drafted that week did not read like compensation for loyalty. It read like recognition of expertise. She was no longer my employee. She was my equal collaborator. The first board meeting she attended as consultant felt like stepping into unfamiliar terrain. Some executives shifted in their seats, unsure how to reconcile their previous perception with this new structure. Marian spoke when necessary, not excessively. Her insights were measured, strategic, incisive. When she outlined a risk in one of our redevelopment proposals, citing socioeconomic displacement pattern I had once ignored, the room listened differently. Not because she demanded attention, because she commanded it. Afterward, the board chair pulled me aside. "You made the right move," he said quietly. No, she did. In interviews that followed, reporters asked about the viral gala moment. This time, I did not soften the narrative. I did not claim foresight. I misjudged her. I said plainly during one segment. I confused silence with absence of intellect. That was my failure. The admission circulated widely. Some praised it. Some criticized it as calculated humility. I no longer controlled how it was interpreted. What mattered was accuracy. Corporate culture shifted gradually. Hiring practices were re-examined. Internal promotion pathways expanded. Analysts who had once hesitated to speak in meetings began contributing more openly. Visibility became less about performance and more about participation. 3 months later, I established a scholarship fund in Marian's name, not as charity, but as correction. It targeted students who paused their education due to family financial obligations. The application required no polished essays about overcoming adversity, only potential. When I told her, she paused before responding. "You don't need to attach my name," she said. "It's not about credit," I replied. "It's about acknowledgement." She studied me for a long moment and then nodded once. "Then ensure it reaches the right hands." Ethan changed too. I saw it in the way he listened during dinner conversations, in the way he challenged classmates who made casual assumptions. One evening he said quietly, "You always told me intelligence earns respect. Now I know it also requires recognition." His words carried both gratitude and critique. I began noticing how often intelligence hides in plain sight, in assistants who draft more insightful emails than executives, in maintenance workers who understand infrastructure better than engineers, in people whose silence is strategic rather than submissive. For years, I had equated visibility with value. If someone did not assert themselves, I assumed they lacked depth. It was easier to reward confidence than to search for competence. That belief had shaped not just my household, but my worldview. Marian never sought revenge. She never exposed me beyond what was necessary. She simply refused to remain small. Guilt did not vanish. It lingered in quiet moments when I passed the kitchen island where I once dismissed her insight, when I remembered the phrase, knows her place, leaving my mouth so casually. But growth replaced defensiveness. One evening, months after the shift, Marian stood beside me at a housing strategy forum. She presented data on equitable development models while I listened. Not as gatekeeper, as partner. The applause that followed belonged to her. And for the first time, I did not feel threatened by it. Years passed. The scholarship fund expanded. Our firm's culture evolved. Ethan pursued economics, though not because I encouraged it, because he wanted to understand systems the way Marian did. Sometimes, late at night, I stand at the same window where I once believed I was untouchable. The skyline still glows the same way. My empire still stands. But I am different. I often wonder how many other silent minds I once dismissed, in boardrooms and offices, in everyday interactions. How many carried brilliance without broadcasting it? How many chose not to speak because the cost of correction felt higher than the reward? Marian chose to speak, and it changed me. The unsettling truth is this: I will never know who didn't. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the quiet people in your own life who hold everything together without recognition. Loyalty is easy to overlook when life feels stable, but it is priceless once it's gone. Like this video, if you believe dignity should never be taken for granted. Share it with someone who needs this reminder. And subscribe for more powerful stories about loyalty, redemption, and the kind of lessons money can't buy.